Hello everyone. Welcome to InterBase XE3 and performance monitoring session. My name is Sriram Balasubramanian and I am the engineering team lead for InterBase at Embarcadero. Today we are going to look at what improvements we have done to InterBase this year and what platforms and scalability and feature enhancements we have done. InterBase XE3, as you all may remember, released last year. At that point in time, we had support for Windows and Mac OS operating systems. This year, we are excited to announce that we are now natively supporting mobile operating system platforms as well. Earlier this year, we enabled support for Apple iOS, so you can develop and deploy Delphi applications with InterBase embedded onto the iOS platform. This will cover all form factors where iOS supports, for example, the iPhone device, iPad devices, and iPod Touch. The InterBase footprint is small enough to get embedded in the Delphi applications for these mobile platforms. We are also excited to announce that we have support for the Android operating system as well. As some of you or many of you might have already heard, RAD Studio XE3 launched last month enables you to develop native Delphi applications and distribute them on Windows, Mac OS X, Android, and iOS operating systems devices with single source and multi-device capabilities. InterBase adds on to that support by making it easy for you to enable data persistence in your applications by embedding InterBase database in your apps. We have a number of editions supported by InterBase. The developer edition, which is what you will encounter or use first to develop your applications, is available on Windows. The InterBase XE3 version is available on 32 as well as 64-bit Windows. If you are using the developer edition on other platforms, as in Mac OS X, Linux, and Solaris, it currently has InterBase XE, which was released a couple of years ago, supported on that platform. The developer edition is also included in the RAD Studio Delphi C++ Builder IDE when you install RAD Studio XE5. It is automatically installed and licensed within the RAD Studio IDE, so you do not have to install the developer edition separately and license it. It is a free edition in that you can use it for development purposes without encountering any limitations. We also provide 4 different editions for your deployment options. InterBase To Go deployment is available in XE3 version on Android, iOS, 32-bit Windows, and 64-bit Windows, and including Mac OS X 32-bit. InterBase Desktop Edition is a Windows-only offering. InterBase Server Edition is available on both 32-bit and 64-bit editions on Windows, and InterBase XE Server Edition is still available on the Unix platforms. IB Lite, which I will get into in a couple of minutes, is a new offering from InterBase. It is a free deployment offering for Android and iOS applications that are developed via the RAD Studio Delphi IDEs. We truly cover multi-device deployment with one database, all native to these platforms. InterBase on mobile covers a few features that you should be aware of. The primary one that I did mention is the native InterBase support on mobile devices. One factor that you should be aware of is that some of the mobile operating systems, as in iOS, and we chose to do the same on Android as well, does not support dynamic loading of libraries. So we do not enable InterBase UDFs, user-defined function libraries, or filters that are externally loaded on these platforms. The Windows and Mac OS X InterBase Server Editions or To Go does allow UDF capability. So please be aware that your mobile platforms will not have UDF support. Other than that, InterBase is the same on all of these 4 platforms. You can use different database components from within RAD Studio to get to InterBase. There are 3 database components, connectivity components available out of the box in RAD Studio. FireDAC, which is our new offering this year, along with DB Express and IBX, which you are very familiar with, are all available, and all 3 connectivity drivers or connectivity solutions support all platforms. IB2Go and IB Lite are the 2 embedded deployment offerings that we have enabled for the mobile platforms. With IB2Go and IB Lite, they are binary compatible. They are essentially just licensing options where IB2Go provides you all the benefits of InterBase on the mobile platforms, and there is a licensing cost for that. Whereas IB Lite is an exciting new offering where you can deploy your applications with an IB Lite license for free. IB Lite license is only available to be embedded for the mobile applications currently, covering both Android and iOS platforms. When you purchase and install your RAD Studio product, you will be receiving a registration email with licenses that you can use for IB Lite deployment. We also provide licenses for IB2Go test deployment. So when you're in your development process, you can embed your IB2Go test deployment license and deploy your apps for testing within your network with the IB2Go license enabled. Of course, this is only for development and testing purposes. When it comes time to deploy your application in production, or you deploy your mobile app to the App Store, whether it is Apple's App Store or the Android marketplace, you will need to include a production license for IB2Go. You can get the production license by contacting your Embarcadero sales representative. IB Lite is a free offering, as I mentioned, for deployment for RAD Studio customers. So in that, you do not need to set up any WAR agreements with Embarcadero to deploy IB Lite. If you're a RAD Studio customer, you get IB Lite license for free. There are many benefits of InterBase that are near and dear to database developers. I will want to highlight 2 such benefits today. InterBase is a small footprint product, and we make it easy for embedded application developers to deploy the database with their application without any involvement of the end user. In that, we have a silent install available for Windows as well as other platforms. The InterBase Server Edition can be included with your application, and you can invoke the InterBase installer and quickly install your application with InterBase built-in. For InterBase to Go and IB Lite applications, the RAD Studio IDE is tightly integrated with InterBase. So when you build and deploy your application from within the IDE makes sure that it includes InterBase to Go files. You would confirm via the IDE's project deployment options that you have selected the right feature files and the license file to deploy with your app. Please note, the deployment target locations for the database files are specific to the platform that you're deploying to. On Windows and Mac OS X, the database can reside in the same directory where the application is, whereas on iOS, it will need to be deployed in the startup documents folder, and on Android, it will need to be deployed to a writable location. Please make sure before you deploy your application for testing that the database target path is set properly for each one of these platforms. One of the highlights of InterBase database file is that it is cross-platform, truly cross-platform. You can build your database, design and develop your database in Windows, and the same database file can be deployed to these other platforms as well. Windows, Mac operating system, iOS and Android, all are little Indian platforms. It makes it easy for InterBase file to be deployed on all of these platforms without enabling or requiring any backup restore process or new creation of database files on this. Now, let's take a look at InterBase performance monitoring. If you're a developer, you would be interested in knowing how your queries are doing, how your application is performing, how the database server is addressing the service requests or SQL requests or query requests from multiple clients at the same time, which tables in your database need further indexing, what are some of the queries that do natural scans on tables, having a high fetch rate or a high page IO rate. If you're a database administrator monitoring the database server, you would be interested in knowing which applications or queries are putting the most load on the system. How is it impacting the performance of other applications or queries? If applications take up limited licenses that you have for the database server, and those applications are either idle or not using those licenses, as an administrator you might want to disconnect those applications from the server. So let's take a look at what InterBase performance monitoring brings to the table and how it addresses those concerns. InterBase performance monitoring is a live view into the internal activity of a database engine. It's implemented as a set of data that's stored in different system global temporary tables, and you can just execute SQL from your applications or from a tool where we have made it available in IB console to see how the database engine is performing. Of course, performance monitoring can only be executed by default by either the owner of the database or sysdba, the database administrator. If you want to allow other database users to do performance monitoring queries, you will need to grant them access to the TMP tables. Use performance monitoring sparingly, as it does put everything else on hold to gather the current snapshot of data from the server's process memory. You can also use IB console and notice how it executes all the different performance monitoring queries by enabling the show performance monitoring data in IB console. In your application, if you're going to be executing performance monitoring queries, please do remember to set the transaction mode to read committed, read only. This has the least impact on the database engine in terms of running the performance monitoring queries, because in your application you may be doing these queries frequently, as in once every minute or once every 2 minutes. You don't want to run through the number of transaction IDs that are available to the database. Since InterBase does have a 2 billion limit on number of transaction IDs, it is important that you keep the number of transactions under control. Your performance monitoring queries are local to your transaction, of course. If someone else is executing performance monitoring queries, they get a snapshot of the data at that instant. When you want to refresh your performance monitoring data, go ahead and execute commit retaining and refresh your data. That will give you a current snapshot of the new performance monitoring information. Of course, since these are global temporary tables, on a commit, the data is deleted from a previous refresh and you get fresh data from then on. Performance monitoring allows you to look at a bunch of database assets or metrics. You can look at current attachments and how long they have been connected from any client. You can look at what statements are currently active or inactive. When I say statements, we mean SQL queries and such coming from your applications. What stored procedures and tables are most used? What are the fetch rates and which stored procedures have been called how many times and things like that. Which tables are most active and impact the database cache by loading a lot of pages from disk. And for really big tables where your queries can be optimized to have proper indexing on them, you can look at sequential selects versus index selects and reduce the sequential selects, which are essentially natural scans on the tables. You can also look at statements and individual statements, how many pages they are fetched from the database. What are some of the long-running transactions? You may want to optimize some of the reporting applications by having shorter duration transactions, especially if they're running in snapshot mode. Maybe there are some reporting applications which are running for hours and hours, and you want to either terminate the transaction because it's putting a heavy load on the system, or it's impacting other SQL queries that are running for a long time. You may also want to terminate certain statements that are not well optimized and are doing natural scans on the tables, especially where you have a very large database, VLDB, and you have gigabytes of data that's loaded from disk to service one particular query. Having a proper index on that will naturally expedite the return of data. So you may want to terminate some of those statements even in production if you find that, or in your development phase. You definitely want to look at the database statistics and increase the fetch versus read ratio, thus putting less stress on the page read from file systems. Now let's go ahead and take a look at IB console and see how we can use some of this information. Now here I have IB console connected on this local system. By the way, this system is called as RAD Studio, and I have a remote system also that is connected from my laptop to this server and this database. So let's go ahead and open up employee database. Employee database is a sample database that is shipped with every InterBase install. So I'm connected to the employee database, and you can look at this employee database as a database in production or database that you're working with in your development project. When you select employee or any database, on the database tab, you can go ahead and right click and select performance monitor. This will bring up an UI, tool that is integrated in performance monitor. A large part of this UI was initially developed by Craig Stunts to fetch information from InterBase performance monitoring SQL tables. So thank you, Craig. It's now integrated in IB console. If you look at the Code Central download items, you might be able to find a separate download of InterBase performance monitoring tool also. But for the benefit of users of InterBase, we have integrated that within IB console and added some additional functionality. So the first tab that you see when performance monitoring comes up is it's connected to the database, employee.gdb, and it has a number of tabs that you can browse through. Before we get into the tabs, let's take a look at some of the menu options that might be useful. Under monitor, you have select presets on how frequently you want to fetch the information. You also have two or three important show options. Show fields allows you to customize what columns you want to see within each tab. Like for example, in the attachments tab, currently attachment ID is not shown. Let's go ahead and select that. And that will show you an attachment ID which the clients are connected with. Similarly, in some of the other tabs, we can go ahead and enable some additional fields that we may be interested in. Things like transaction attachment ID, statement ID coming in for statements. Under transactions, we may be interested in looking at attachment ID also, as well as transaction ID. This is just so you have additional information when you're browsing through IB console performance monitor. The other option is SOAP performance monitoring data. This is a very nice tool to actually learn what performance monitoring queries are being run. So when you look at certain statements that are being observed in performance monitor, you can learn from it as in, okay, these are the kind of queries that performance monitoring tool runs to get information. You can use some of these queries yourself in your applications if you want to build in SQL queries for performance monitoring within your applications. Now let's take a quick look on some of these tabs provide. The Attachments tab gives you information about the attachment itself, of course, where the attachment is coming from, the IP address of the machine, where the attachment is coming from. For a local machine, of course, it is 127.01 is the IP address, which is where I'm connected from in RAD Studio. When I'm attaching from a different machine, the host name of the machine as well as the IP address is displayed. And another critical piece of information is a process ID of the application that is connecting to this database. You can use any or all of this information to identify applications that are connected to this system, to this database. The database user is also prominently featured in the username. Login time is another important artifact within an attachment. You would like to know how long has an attachment been connected to the system. There is some additional cumulative information that is stored for a particular attachment, what kind of database stress it is putting on this particular database. The database tab shows you a list of information with regard to how much memory is the database using, things like cache buffers, or this is basically your database cache in memory, how many pages have been loaded, how big is your database file on disk, page fetches and page reads. These are two critical pieces of information that you would want to keep track of to make sure that your fetch rate is much higher than your read rate. You don't want to be incurring a lot of page reads from disk. The transaction ID information is also provided as part of this collateralize or this cumulative tab. You can observe the next transaction ID versus the oldest snapshot to see how long is a particular transaction running and which is impacting any kind of garbage collection or sweep from happening in the database. The memory tab allows you to see how internal memory allocations for this particular database is distributed. The red color out here shows that the database cache is normally one of the biggest ones, since this is a very small database. In this case, oh, there we go. The cache is one of the bigger ones, whereas every other internal artifact within the database engine uses less amount of memory. Of course, this is going to differ based on how many store procedures are being run, how some of the internal requests have been initiated, and things like that. And as your cache keeps on increasing, which is typical in a large database, you will see this memory value increasing. It is important for you to set a large enough cache for large databases. We'll come to the procedures tab a little bit later. The tables and views show for individual tables that are loaded into the cache and what kind of activity they're seeing in terms of sequential selects, in terms of how many pages for a particular table has been fetched and read from disk. You can use this to showcase how to reduce the number of sequential selects, which are natural scans, and how to increase your index selects from queries that can be optimized. The transaction tab shows information about a particular transaction, any set of transactions. I see that some transactions that are coming from remote are connected as a snapshot, or some of them are coming in as read committed transaction. One point to note here, the performance monitoring queries have to be run with read-only, read-committed transaction, as I mentioned earlier. So you will notice that performance monitoring, which is here read-only and read-committed, is enabled for, and thus it's a pre-committed transaction. If you look at where this attachment is coming from, you will notice that it's active from within Performance Monitor, which is connected locally from IB console. Triggers show likewise cumulative information about what triggers have been active, what kind of stress do they put on the system. With regard to procedures, let's go ahead and execute a query in IB console which will make use of some procedure. Now this is a store procedure, and if we take a look at Performance Monitor, it shows that all LANGs have been executed once, It's been called once, but within all langs, show langs procedure has been executed 31 times. So you can use this performance monitor tool to look at what kind of activity does the store procedure do, how many pages has it fetched, how many times has it invoked some other procedure, and if that show langs procedure, for example, has a high fetch rate out here since it's been executed 31 times. So you can use some of this information to optimize specific store procedures or your queries. In InterBase XE3, we have made some additional enhancements to show cumulative page I/O and fetch count rates for tables, store procedures, and triggers. We have also enabled monitoring of DDL statements or any kind of alter, create table, alter index, or create index kind of statements, all of the DDL commands with TMP statements as well. Now let's take a look at how we can take some action based on monitoring some of the data. Now be careful in terms of allowing other users to update TMP tables, as that will allow them to shut down any attachment or active transactions and statements. That's why the default permissions is sysdba and owner for performance monitoring. Let's take a look at some of these options: how to shut down an idle connection, how to terminate long-running transactions, how to cancel a long-running statement, which is probably badly optimized and is putting a heavy stress on the system, and how to sweep a database for asynchronous databases, for example, if you wanted to just do that, so to reduce the gap and increase garbage collection. You can also clean up store procedure clones that are not active anymore on demand. To keep the traffic less out here, let's go ahead and disable performance monitoring data queries, so we can look at user queries that are being run within this database. Since I'm connected from a remote system, which is a typical setup in a client-server environment, you may have multiple clients from different systems connecting to this database and executing queries. I'm going to be running such a bad query from a remote system, so we can observe what kind of load it puts on the server and cancel that statement. Okay, I've gone ahead and started executing a query. You notice in your task manager or someone reports that your system is not responsive enough, and you go ahead and notice that IB server is running at a full 100% CPU rate on one of the cores. This is a quad core system, so you see it's being shown as 25% CPU rate. So one of the CPU is being actively used by IB server just to service one query. So let's go ahead and use IB console to see what it's doing. You will notice the first thing you need to do is go to the statements tab and notice what query is doing a lot of work. A quantum is a piece of work, so any amount of records and page IOs and things like that that a query is executing shows up as a large quantum. So if you look at that particular query, you will notice that it's a 6-way self-join of employee table leading to billions of records before the count can be returned back to the application. We can use IB console's performance monitor to find the transaction that is executing it, but even better, find the attachment that is responsible for it. When we click on find attachment, it shows you that it's coming from a host. That's my laptop, that's a remote system, and what process ID is executing that query. So let's go. As a database administrator or a developer, we have decided that this statement is a bad statement and needs to be terminated immediately. We'll go back to the query and go ahead and cancel the statement. Now, of course, when you cancel the statement, the application, the statement or the request is cancelled within the database engine, and the application has sent an exception saying that your operation was cancelled. When we refresh the information, when we refresh the performance monitoring data, we notice that the statement that was running crazy has been terminated, and the task manager shows IB server utilizing minimal CPU resources. So thus you can actually reduce or take away bad queries or statements from remote applications and bring the system back to normalcy. Now let's go ahead and see how to go. There are certain additional parameters that you can or actions that you can perform within IB console performance monitor. So if you go to the database tab, you'll notice this flush write cache, reclaim memory, and sweep. Let's go into each one of these individually. Flush write cache is useful when you have to flush the cache for asynchronous databases. For synchronous database and direct IO databases, you don't have a problem with that. So you want to make sure that your dirty pages are being written back to disk. So you can flush write cache from within here. Reclaim memory is an option where you want to collect unused clones of stored procedures and triggers. Now in this case, of course, there was one stored procedure that has been used, and I can go ahead and take care of cleaning up any clones that have not been collected yet. Sweep is basically an operation that you can execute. You can either execute from within by using the command line tool gfix, or you can run sweep from here. There are some miscellaneous known issues within IB console. The counters that you see are 32-bit values. It does not impact how a database engine internally performs, but these are being shown in the performance monitor data as 32-bit integer values. We'll go ahead and fix that. Performance monitoring can only be executed on a single database at a time. So if you want PM data from multiple data sources, you want to be executing individual connections and transactions on those. The statements tab currently only shows 1024 bytes for the query itself. We will go ahead and fix this bug in an upcoming update. And IB console also has a bug where it does not bring up performance monitor for any users that have been additionally granted access to TMP tables. For sysdba and owner of the database, it does show the option. This will be fixed too. Let's take a look at another functionality within the performance monitor UI called as log visualization. Log visualization is useful where you want to monitor the performance of the server over a period of time, and you want to persist all of the data for analysis later on. So you bring up IB console, set up logging at certain intervals, right? Whatever you choose it to be, like once every 10 minutes, and you can selectively check which assets you want to log or archive the logs for in terms of performance monitoring data. You can come back later on, stop the logging, and visualize the log data. Let's take a look at IB console and how we can do that. If you see the logging option, setup logging, you can go ahead and say, I'm interested in logging information for attachments and how the database is performing, what's the table activity over a period of, say, every 10 seconds. I recommend that you set this up to be minutes. Just for the performance, just for the case of this demo, I set that to be 10 seconds. We'll go ahead and create the necessary tables that are persistent tables in the database. And yes, we want to start logging right now. Let's give it a few seconds to notice how, and I'm going to be executing some queries from a remote system. And I'll go ahead and execute some query from here as well. Go ahead and stop the logging process. Let's take a look and see if we can identify what kind of logs. So when you look for what logging has been, what performance monitoring data has been archived over those defined intervals of every 10 seconds, it looks like we got 4 snapshots for every 10 seconds. For the last 40 seconds, we have taken some snapshot. So in the attachments, database, and tables and views, which is what we selectively logged information about, you can go ahead and expand some of that information, see what was logged and what are the details. This is a pure performance monitoring view into all of the data that you saw earlier, and you can compare between 2 time snapshots and see what kind of activity has been happening on the system. Like for example, when we look at table data, if we wanted to see how a particular employee table, what kind of metrics employee table saw over a period of time, we can notice that and compare that information also. Wanted to quickly show how we can use performance monitoring to increase the index selects on a particular table and reduce the amount of sequential selects. Let's come out of the database so we can get a fresh look. Let's go into the database once again. And if we look at performance monitor, there's nothing loaded on the cache since we disconnected it completely and restarted for the purpose of this particular demo. And we'll go ahead and execute a query to select information from the employee table where there's a natural scan on the table. You will notice in performance monitor that the table employee, which is where we selected from, has 88 pages were fetched for that and 6 pages were read from the disk. The statement that actually did that was select star from employee, which is right here, and the statement also encountered 88 page fetches. So there's a direct correlation between which statement actually encountered so many page fetches. The reason for this is obviously because the query itself did a natural scan on the table. Let's go ahead and put in an index. So I've already pre-created an index and it's currently inactive, but I will go ahead and activate that. Let's alter and activate the index on employee first name, which is what we are using in the where condition of the SQL query. Now that we have an index on this, the fetch rate should come down drastically. If we go ahead and execute the same query once again, we'll notice from the plan that the query is using an index. Let's go ahead and see what kind of statistics. In terms of number of fetches, it's only done 6 fetches now instead of 88 fetches from the table. Let's go ahead and see how performance monitor shows up the same information. You will notice that the same table, since we executed it twice, the statement that's currently running has the number of page fetches as 4. That is, now that there's an index on first name, the number of fetches from the database is only 4 pages instead of 88 pages. You'll also notice that within the tables view for employee table, you have managed to do index selects on that and reduce the number of records that are selected sequentially. The first execution did a sequential select, so you saw all 42 records being looked at to get the employee with the first name Robert. The second, with the optimized index on the table, did only one index select. So having a lot more index selects means that your table is well optimized with proper indices. Now, thank you for listening in on InterBase Performance Monitoring. Here are some further demos and reading information that's available on our web. I hope you have a well-performing InterBase that you can embed with your applications. Good luck.
All right, thank you, Sriram. And joining us in the RAD Studio here is Sriram. Thank you.
Hello, everyone.
What are the other restrictions of IB Lite, size of database, UDFs, etc.?
First, to just preface, IB Lite and IB to go are binary compatible and are only different in the way they enable certain features within the product. IB to go is multi-platform in that it can run on Windows, Mac, iOS, and Android, whereas IB Lite is currently only licensed to RAD Studio or Delphi users of XE4 and XE5, and IB Lite is only enabled for iOS and Android. That's for mobile platforms today. In terms of size of databases, IB2Go has no limitations, but IB Lite is limited to 100 megabytes of database. Of course, IB Lite is a royalty-free deployment. It will allow up to 100 megabytes of database file. It will allow one application level transaction, one connection, whereas IB2Go will not have any such restrictions. It will allow many connections, simultaneous connections, and at the same time unlimited number of simultaneous transactions as the application chooses to have. And there are a couple more restrictions, mainly in the feature set for encryption. IB2Go allows both weak and strong encryption for data at rest, as well as data that's in transit over the network to remote interface servers. And so that's based on SSL. And IB Lite does not have any encryption enabled. It's the interface that you knew of before encryption was implemented. So that's how IB Lite and IB2Go are structured to compare in terms of feature sets. On mobile platforms, since I did hear about UDFs, On mobile platforms, we do not support UDF libraries. That is, on iOS and Android right now, you cannot use UDFs with your applications and InterBase. Whereas on Windows and Mac, IB2Go will allow you to use UDF libraries just like you would with Server Edition or Desktop Edition on Windows.
Great, thank you. How about an IB Lite for Windows and Mac?
I'm glad to hear of that request. We are always, of course, looking at how we can help customers use InterBase in different scenarios. For RAD Studio XE4 and XE5, since the focus has been mobile platform support, that is where we have enabled support for IB Lite as well. We'll definitely take this requirement or request into consideration in the future and see if IB Lite, it makes sense for us to have IB Lite available on the other desktop platforms as well.
Any comparison chart between InterBase and SQL Server and between IB Lite and SQLite?
How much time do we have, Jim? Well,
I don't know, yeah, I'm not sure if he's looking for speed or what areas are they similar or where are they different? I guess maybe a couple high points.
SQL Server is a product from Microsoft, and it appeals to a wide range of application scenarios, and it has its own set of strengths. But InterBase has also had a very good history. I mean, it's 25 plus years of development in InterBase. It's got a wonderful architecture in terms of multi-versioning, MVCC or MGA as we all know, and it's very suitable to certain applications, all the way from a single user connection to hundreds of simultaneous users connected to the database server. InterBase obviously is a multi-platform product. It works well on Windows and as well on Linux and Solaris and Mac OS X and now on mobile platforms. SQL Server is a Windows-specific technology, as we all know. So I would say that's the highlight differentiation between the two products. InterBase is well supported in RAD Studio with multiple database connectivity. At the same time, both SQL Server and InterBase, of course, has open database connectivity solutions like ODBC and JDBC and every other standard connectivity solutions. So in that way, it makes it easy for application developers to use any of the development frameworks to get to InterBase. We cover pretty much many of the standard connectivity solutions out there.
Are there tools that exist to migrate a SQL Server database to InterBase?
I'm sure there are a few in the community. We may have to look up specific ones, but there are tools that allow you to export and import into different database backends from SQL Server to InterBase, and from I think there's one by the name of IB Data Pump. There are other tools which do the same too. Yeah, I don't remember a lot of that above my head, but there are also tools that Embarcadero supports. We have RAD Studio, Rapid SQL, Change Manager. Rapid SQL and Change Manager also support InterBase natively, as they do Microsoft SQL Server. And RAD Studio does the same too. So you might be able to reverse engineer and forward engineer databases using some of our own tools.
Another question about performance comparisons between InterBase and other databases.
I think it's an easy question to answer. At the same time, it's one of the most difficult ones to answer. The easy one is, yes, it totally depends on how you use the database backend, what your application's needs are, what your scalability needs are, how the SQL language support enables you to write optimized queries, what kind of indexing technologies are there. So you can take the best of databases out there and have it perform the worst, but at the same time you can have a database that is very minimal in performance metrics, but if the application is designed well, it can really utilize the full strengths of the database backend. So I'm sorry I don't have any specifics about performance, but we have every single release of InterBase over the last at least 15 years. We are focused on improving performance every single release. Some of the specific highlights having that have gone into our releases have been, the Super Server multi-threaded architecture for SMP platforms. So we scale well from a single core to multi-core systems. we scale really well without any application modifications, all the way from a single connected, a single threaded application to hundreds of simultaneous users working with tens and hundreds of gigabytes of data. So, and with our 64-bit edition release back in InterBase 2000, after InterBase 2009 in InterBase XE, it basically we have removed the higher limit of memory usage, and so we are a 64-bit process. We have a 64-bit edition on Windows right now, and a lot of customers are putting InterBase 64-bit to use very well to scale up their current installations.
Excellent, thank you. There's a lot of people here saying thanks for a great session. Thank you for making InterBase on iOS and Android. More comments along those lines. So everybody's very appreciative. Where is the logging stored?
What kind of logging are we? Are we thinking about the journaling support that we introduced in InterBase?
Maybe
2009. Okay. I mean, if you are thinking about write-ahead logging, or as we call it, journaling, InterBase supports, of course, both short-term journaling as well as long-term journaling called as journal archives. So for instantaneous recovery, you can use short-term journaling, and the journal file is by default stored in the same directory as the database file. You can create your journal directory to be on a different disk if you choose to, because you might have two different disk controllers. You don't want them to compete with each other. The database file writes as well as the journal writes going to the same directory or the same disk controller. So you can sort of divide them up into two different disks and improve the performance. Disaster recovery is another name that we have assigned with journal archiving, where you might want to recover the journals or the write-ahead logs on another system, should there be a system failure on the primary database server. You can set up the journal archives also on a different disk on the same system. Sort of defeats the purpose, but you can also put it on a SanDisk, and you can have a different server reading and recovering from that SanDisk on a frequent basis, so it's always up to speed on all the data changes that have happened. It is not real time. You still have to have the recovery process run in whatever frequency you choose to run. But again, we have known people sort of recovering every 15 seconds. So they have a standby server ready to go in case they need to recover data and move forward.
Okay.
I would say, just add on to that, there are DDL commands that we have in ISQL called as create journal and create journal archive, where you can define the directories where these journals go. I think that was a question, right? Where do these journal files go, or
right.
the logging files go? Yeah.
What's the difference in the footprint of IB Lite and IB2Go?
That's also a very easy question to answer, because the footprint, there is no difference. IB2Go and IB Lite are binary compatible. In fact, IB Lite is just a license, a different license on the IB2Go binaries.
Okay.
So you can definitely develop your IB2Go applications today, and when it comes time to deploy, you can decide whether you want to go with the IB Lite license with the reduced feature set, or you want to go with IB2Go to use, simultaneous transactions and larger database files and encryption and such.
Does the one connection for IB Lite allow for multiple simultaneous transactions?
There is one transaction for the application that can be used in IB Lite. Yes, so there is a transaction limit.
One transaction at a time?
Yes.
Actually, I remember the first time I talked to someone about the idea of multiple transactions nested, and it just blew their mind.
Yeah, not all databases support multiple transactions within the same connection. Yeah.
Yeah, they're like, whoa, really? Whoa. From a developer standpoint, SQL Server Express is hard to beat with a license agreement like this. Yada, yada, yada. They're a license agreement. If InterBase had a way to do this, I would consider. So I guess they're looking for an Express, like IB Lite edition of InterBase.
On desktop platforms?
I'm guessing so.
Okay. So as always, please do get in touch with your sales contact within the region, and please do communicate to us what kind of licensing requirements are there for your applications. We're always eager to hear. Maybe we can definitely set up some kind of an agreement where it's more cost effective to embed InterBase in your applications. From what we hear, InterBase is already one of the total cost of ownership of building InterBase into applications is very low today, and our customers love us for that. And it's obviously there are other benefits, other values that the product brings along, but cost is not a major impediment for them to include InterBase. But at the same time, every application is different in how it's sold to your customers. So you may have certain needs that Embarcadero can take a look at.
Yeah,
please do communicate.
Yeah, cost is one feature of a database, not always the deciding one. So here's a question about comparing it to MySQL. There's differences. Anything specific jumps out at you?
Nothing specific comes to my mind right now. Of course, MySQL has a huge community of developers and open source developers, and of course now it's part of the Oracle portfolio. So it obviously has a largest set of community participating and improving it and using it, especially in web development. So it has its own strengths. And there are also good tools on MySQL to scale it, and there are other products that are based off of MySQL. That said, InterBase can stand its own. It performs well in a complex set of applications used all the way from OLTP to online complex processing, as we call them. We can have reporting as well as OLTP applications using the same database, and our multi-generation architecture or versioning really complements that. So I would say do try and use InterBase where you might have a need for MySQL, and let us know if you see any shortcomings. I would think we'll stack up pretty well.
Okay. So Stephen Ball commented, we are working on a demo of using RAD Studio to show how to get data to mobiles. Keep tuned. Follow @InterBase on Twitter. Looks like it's @InterBase_.
Wonderful. Thanks, Stephen.
Alan says, InterBase is awesome. I've been using it forever and has performed amazingly well. Can't wait to get it running on mobile now.
Great, Alan, and others who are currently developing with InterBase for mobile. It is obviously a new offering for us this year from us, and we are very excited about it. Especially the small footprint of InterBase really adheres very well with mobile applications, and the embeddability of that too. So please do send us your any additional requirements you might have. I think we have a compelling technology here with the support of encryption within the product and small footprint, and also be able to sort of embed as well as go client server using the same library from within the same application. It has very good support for data snap as well to do multi-tier development. So you can use it in a wide gamut of application scenarios. So please do let us know if there are other areas for mobile that you may have a need for InterBase to support in terms of feature sets or cloud or anything else. So please do let us know what kind of feature requests you may have.
So there's a few questions here on pricing. I'm going to send them a link to the licensing page on our site, but definitely if you're looking at possibly more than one system, like deploying it, that would make you a reseller at that point, or a VAR. So talk to a sales rep and they'll get you a deal on that, most likely. Performance logging in IB console, it was part of the demo.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay, that's what the logging we talked about earlier. Where does that stored at, the performance logging in IB console?
Oh, okay, thank you. Sorry, I mistook the logging question earlier to be write-ahead logging. Performance logging, as in IB console, it's called as log visualization, and it's essentially storing the data in frequent intervals, the performance monitoring data, within the same database file. So if you have enabled log visualization or logging for a particular database, you will see some user level tables with names like log dollar statements, log dollar attachments, depending upon what entities within the database you're trying to monitor. So that is where the data is collected. When you go back later and stop the logging and visualize the data, all the data is being serviced by those log dollar tables within the same database. Once you're done using the data, you can delete the table or remove the records without impacting any other user level data.
Jason says, I want to comment that I'm very optimistic the InterBase is in a great position to capture a very significant portion of the mobile data storage niche. Kudos to all the work you have done in that direction. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. And Stephen points out again, he goes, he hears that Oracle is working to make changes on the MySQL license to charge a license fee for it being used commercially. I know they offer that now, but I guess they want to move people in that direction. And so he said he's heard that for most users, it works out to be cheaper. InterBase works out to be cheaper than the annual license fee for MySQL. So, is there a profiling button? Or, I'm sorry, is there profiling built into InterBase?
Profiling, as in how your queries are working?
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay. I think if you're alluding to audit logging, then we don't have internal audit logging of every query that's running or every person that's connected to the database. Like we don't have any stream-based audit logging enabled. But in terms of profiling specific queries, we have SQL-related plans. So you can submit a query to be prepared, and you can look at the plan structure on how the query is going to be optimized, what kind of indices are going to be used to execute that query. So yes, you can profile specific queries in InterBase. In ISQL, if you're using the command line tool, you can do set plan on, and that will basically dump out, explain the statement and what kind of optimization entities it's going to be using, what kind of indices or order by, how it's going to optimize your order by and group by clauses and things like that. You would definitely want to try and use performance monitor and identify some of those major blockers in terms of time sync queries, and see what kind of tables they're using, what kind of stored procedures they're using. And just as I demoed in the presentation today, you'll want to walk through that and see which are some of your big time sinks in terms of queries, and optimize by adding certain indices. So profiling is available in both of those respects. One is a SQL level profiling with plan, explains, and the other one is via performance monitoring.
So question, how easy is it to migrate from Firebird 2.1 to InterBase?
I would say, both Firebird and InterBase share a lot of legacy in terms of SQL support as well as platforms. That said, Firebird 2.1 is I would think it's a few years since they released 2.1. The one thing we want to look out is if there are any specific Firebird SQL features that you've used in your application that are not available in InterBase. That's what you need to look out for. Otherwise, I think it should be fairly easy to just back up your Firebird database using the GBack tool and restore it in InterBase. So it should be possible. Oh, another area other than SQL you would want to look at is if you have any extensive use of stored procedures. There are certain commands within stored procedures like execute statement. Now InterBase also has execute statement support, but I think Firebird has also execute block. InterBase does not support execute block. So you'll have to take a look at in Firebird 2.1 if they have added any new SQL support that you have already included in your applications that you might want in InterBase. So that's something that you need to migrate.
So Stephen Ball again points out that if there are any InterBase customers out there listening to this, he would love to hear what you're using InterBase for right now. And you can email him at stephen.ball@embarcadero.com. Any comments and feedbacks on feature requests, and if you would like to join their customer focus group. So if you are using InterBase and would like to be a part of that, let Stephen know. A note about profiling capabilities from Jason. You can also get a great amount of profiling data via API calls. This has all been exposed in IB objects and is automatically dumped into the client SQL trace logs.
That's right. Thanks, Jason, for bringing that up. Yes, the client. So the client connectivity solutions like IB objects or IBX, and there are many different layers of client connectivity, or many different products that allow or support connectivity to InterBase, and each of them have their own profiling tools, as Jason is highlighted here for IB objects. Even IBX has a monitoring component which can do the same. So if you're interested in profiling specific clients, I would highly encourage you to look at what database connectivity solution you're using there, and use the profiling tools in there to just get a list of SQL queries that you're executing.
Excellent. All right. So it's top of the hour, actually 2 minutes past. We got one last quick question here, which I think is going to be a quick one, and then we're going to move on. Alan says they develop Delphi applications for in-house use. They deploy that software to use SQL Server Express on individual machines that do specific tasks within enterprise. What kind of license would they need to use InterBase in-house?
You can use any one of our editions. Since you're using SQL Server Express, I assume that it's on Windows, and you're using it to embed within your applications. Depending upon if you're using a single application or multiple applications on the desktop, you might want to go with a desktop edition or a server edition of InterBase if you're using multiple applications within the same system. But if it is just a single application using a database file at the backend, you could use InterBase to go as well. So on Windows, you can use either InterBase to go if you want it embedded in a single application with a single database, or if you want multiple applications accessing the same database file on the system, you can go with either desktop or server edition. Where server edition would be useful is if you want remote applications from other systems also connecting to the same database file. So you can use either one of these three editions.
And you can talk to sales, and you can look at the licensing page and see where the prices start at, or talk to sales, and they can work out a deal if you need have more than one license for multiple users.
Absolutely. We do have bulk licensing set up. I mean, you can, if you're using desktop or to go, you can buy packs of 100, 20 or 100 as your company needs. But at the same time, if you need the server edition and you want a number of systems to be supported, you will definitely get volume discounts.
Yep. All right. Well, excellent. Thank you so much for all the questions, and thank you for your time, Sriram, and for that great presentation on InterBase.